In this slide, in this time period right here, where there's about 100,000 filings, there's only about 10,000 that are completed. And so many people who maybe get behind on their mortgage and fall behind on their payments and get a foreclosure notice filed with the courts don't actually get foreclosed on, because far fewer, about 10% of the foreclosures that are filed are actually completed and taken back. What's happening, friends? I made a bunch of videos over the last few years about foreclosures and foreclosure rates, and we're still seeing to this day headlines all across the country about foreclosures. And so I did some real quick clips here and grabbed some headlines from some news sources out there about foreclosures. And if you look at this, U.S. foreclosure activity on the rise, U.S. foreclosure activity increases quarterly in Q1, foreclosure filings rose in October. Could this trend continue in 2025? And we continue to see this type of information out there, which creates fear in the marketplace about foreclosures, and potentially something similar to 2007, where we saw a flood of foreclosures and the crash in the market. And so it's also important to look at the actual data outside of the headlines and look at the data over time. And so that's what I got for you today, is some perspective, some historical perspective over foreclosures and foreclosure rates and what's actually happening in the market, because it tells a very different story. So if we look at the number of properties with a foreclosure filing, right? So the bank goes in and files with the court to foreclose on a property. This goes back to 2005. We saw the big increase in 2007 and 2008. And those were the years where there was over almost a million filings per quarter in the number of banks that were foreclosing on properties. But since that time, right? Since 2010, we've seen that rate dramatically drop back down to about historical averages, right? So historical averages is around 100,000 to 200,000 filings. That's pretty normal. That's the way it's been for decades and decades. But then we saw this big drop off right here. And this was COVID, right? When there was all of the foreclosure moratoriums and the forbearance and those types of things. And so there was a huge decrease, right? To like 20,000 per quarter back in 2020. And it did start to tick back up again. And this is where you saw some of these headlines about foreclosures increasing, the rates increasing. And over time, it's kind of stabled off since 2022, 23, 24. We've kind of seeded back at these normal historical averages, about 100,000 filings. And if you look at, there was a tiny little dip in the end of like 24 and a little tiny increase in 25. And so if you take that as a snapshot, that's where you get a headline of foreclosures are starting to increase, when really over time, it's not a significant change. It's what's always been happening. And so if we look at this is another interesting comparison. Is if we look, okay, we can pretty much see that historically around 100,000 filings per quarter is pretty normal over the course of the last couple of decades. If you look at the number of completed foreclosures, and this is important, right? Because just because someone gets foreclosed on, it doesn't mean, or a filing is filed, it doesn't mean that the house is actually foreclosed on. Because if you didn't know, you should definitely know. If you know anybody who is in this type of situation, if you talk to a real estate professional and we do an analysis on the home, if you have equity in the house, even if you're behind on your mortgage, in most cases, the banks will work with us to put that house on the market, because the bank will prefer to get paid whatever they're owed with the fees that are attached to it, rather than going through the foreclosure process. And if you have equity in your home, if you bought the home anytime in the last 5 years, most likely you have some equity in that home, and you can sell it, get out of the mortgage, and not have to get foreclosed on. And that is why this number is so different than the previous number. Is if you look at the number of completed foreclosures, so homes that are actually foreclosed on, not just the filing in the bank, it's significantly lower, right? This bottom line is 50,000. So we're talking 10,000 completed foreclosures in the same time period that we were looking at in this slide. In this time period right here, where there's about 100,000 filings, there's only about 10,000 that are completed. And so many people who maybe get behind on their mortgage and fall behind on their payments and get a foreclosure notice filed with the courts don't actually get foreclosed on, because far fewer, about 10% of the foreclosures that are filed are actually completed and taken back by the bank. So super important perspective here to understand is, this trend pretty much follows the foreclosure trend. But if you look even in the height of the crisis back in 2008, 2009, where there was almost 1 million foreclosure filings, there were really only 300,000 completed. And it was really between 250. We didn't even hit 300,000 completed foreclosures. So the number of foreclosures that actually happen are far fewer than the ones that are actually filed. And it's something that's really important to understand long term. And looking at the real estate market over the last 5 years, there's been such a huge increase in the values of real estate that really, if you bought in 2021, 22, you have an increase in price. Even if you paid 100%, you did 100% down payment or zero down payment, 100% mortgage, you have some equity built in and you can still sell that property. You don't have to get foreclosed on. If you're looking to relocate here on the Big Island, I want to share with you a resource that we put together. Over 80 agents from my team, expert agents here on the Big Island, put together a relocation guide that will help you evaluate all of the important factors that you want to take into account before you move here to the Big Island. School districts, healthcare, employment, all of the things that you got to think about, we put into one home buyer's guide that will help you figure out what is best when you start this relocation process here to the Big Island. So if you want this guide, just click on the link below, fill out the form. We will send you the guide for free. And if you want to take the next steps and have a conversation with us, we'd be happy to help. Looking at across the country, these are the top 10 states with the highest number of foreclosures. So it's one unit for every, for example, in Nevada, there's one foreclosure for every 2,700 housing units. And again, this, you can look at this. I can give you this if you're interested all the way down for all 50 states. But since this is a Hawaii channel and you're interested in Hawaii, if you're interested in what the Hawaii foreclosure data is, we are ranked 39th in the country. So near the bottom in terms of the number of properties with filings and the foreclosure rate. So foreclosures on average are lower in Hawaii than they are in other states. And so you really don't have a ton to worry about here, because looking at the historical numbers, we're back to kind of historical averages, but still very low rates of actual foreclosures happening. And there's nothing really on the horizon that's going to change that because of the price increases and the equity that most homeowners have in their property. There isn't a need to foreclose because they're not behind on their mortgage in terms of the value of their home, like we saw in 2007, 8, 9, where the prices actually fell. And so people were underwater and were over leveraged and didn't have the ability to sell the house. They had to give it up and walk away from it. So very different situation here. If you have any questions about this or anything else Hawaii real estate related, you can always reach out to me, Dylan@buybigisland.com, or there is a link in the description below to my calendar. Feel free to book a meeting and we'll have a conversation about whatever it is that you're interested in. I always appreciate you guys watching. I'll see you guys next week. Aloha.